Hello, AP Biology students. Let's go over the fifth section in Unit 7. In this section, we're going to talk about something called the Hardy-Weinberg equation. I like to start out this section with the first actual definition of evolution that we're going to talk about. This is any change in the allele frequency in a population over time. When we talk about a gene pool, we're talking about all of the alleles from all of the organisms in a population. And this is typically the image you're going to see for gene pool. You can see each one of these organisms has a genotype. Again, these genotypes are made of two alleles. All of the alleles of all of the organisms in a population is known as a gene pool. When the frequencies of the dominant and recessive alleles change in a population, that's going to be evolution. That's part of the reason why we can say evolution is fact, because we can witness the changes in these allele frequencies change in a population over time. We can observe this with firsthand experience. Now, we also use something called the Hardy-Weinberg equation to see how these frequencies change. In a population, the P value is going to represent the frequency of the dominant allele, while the Q value is going to represent the frequencies of the recessive allele. So if we look here, P plus Q equals 1 is our first equation, and that should make sense. The frequency of the dominant allele plus the frequency of the recessive allele equals 1, or 100%. If you look at this diagram, we can see those frequencies of the capital and the lowercase, or the dominant recessive, change in this gene pool over time. This is evolution. There's another equation we have to look at, and it's going to be because of these Punnett squares. You can see it's P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. The homozygous dominant genotype is going to be represented by this P squared since there are two Ps. PQ is going to represent the heterozygous genotype because there are one of each allele, and you can see there are two of them in this Punnett square. The homozygous recessive genotype is going to be represented by Q squared. And again, this equation should make sense because if you add up the amount of Q squared, P squared, and 2PQ, it should equal 100%. My biggest piece of advice for going through these Hardy-Weinberg equations is to start with the recessive genotype. I'm actually not going to go over a bunch of these different examples of how to work through a Hardy-Weinberg equation in this TikTok because I've made plenty of example problems and other ones that you can look up. So just look up Hardy-Weinberg equation on TikTok and you'll find some of my work. One last concept to go over with the Hardy-Weinberg equation is something called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. This is when a population's allele frequencies don't change from one generation to the next. You can see this population is in Hardy-Weinberg because the amount of big A and little a, or dominant versus recessive, doesn't change over time. If a population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, these 5 things must be met. And by things, I mean conditions. First, there must be no mutation, so no new alleles arise by random changes. Second, there is no migration in the gene pool, so organisms aren't leaving and organisms aren't going into the gene pool. Third, there must be a large gene pool. Small populations have a higher chance of genetic drift, so we need a large gene pool. Fourth, there is just random mating. There's no choice by who is going to be chosen for reproduction based on their phenotype. And lastly, there is no selection, artificial or natural. And if this seems like it's impossible, yeah, this just shows that populations are always evolving. Even the slightest changes in environments or selection pressures are going to change the allele frequencies of a population over time. So it's really not possible for a population to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And yes, this is where my students start to complain that it feels like math is always being used or applied in AP Biology. Get used to it because biology is applied math.